Well, I'm here again, and as I always commence, brothers and sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals. Now, as I've said, I make hats. If I make a hat and it fits your head, that's on you. So if you choose to be a brother or a sister, fine with me. A friend, I can tell by your conduct. Enemy, I disregard enemies because that means people have a negative attitude, which nothing I say is going to alter. So I just dismiss them with the notion that they're entitled to their opinion. And as long as they don't put their hands on me, they won't have anything to worry about from me. I'm a man of peace. There was a general and he made that comment and people wondered what in the world he meant. He said, well, I want a piece of this, a piece of that, and a piece of the other. That's why in English, words can sound exactly the same, but they have an entirely different meaning. But when they're written, you can see what the word is and what it means. When I say neutrals, those are the people who don't want to take the time to make an opinion, or they just don't have opinions, or it's come see, come saw, let it be the way it is, live and let live. So I want to cover the waterfront. Underneath it all, we're human beings. We communicate by means of the spoken word in a situation such as that I find myself in here. I speak English, so I use English. But often I do wonder, now that I will be 85 years old in July, what would I be had my ancestors not been dragged over here in chains from Africa? What language would I speak? Africa is not a city. Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent. I have no way of knowing what my origins are. But unlike some people, I'm not going to contact that, I guess you call it a company that will help you find your roots. What difference does it make to me? And this is a rhetorical question. It's not asking for an answer. If I had an ancestor who raised horses or stole horses, one person said, the thing about talking about your ancestors is that it's like beets. The best part is underground. So every pot has to stand on its own bottom. Now, if it could be accepted by everybody that anything born of a man and a woman is a human being, if the world started with two people, and that's hard for me to believe, but if it did, then everybody literally would be related. Everybody would share aspects of the same DNA. If you consider the number of people currently on the earth, and there are mathematicians out there, statisticians, others, how long would it take to have a population the size of the earth if it started with just two people? But even the Bible makes that hard to believe, because when Cain killed his brother Abel, all that, if you read the Bible, you would know is that there were two adults and two boys who had grown to manhood in the garden, four people. But that cannot be the whole story, because when Cain killed Abel, God banished him from the garden. Cain said, this is too cruel, and I'm paraphrasing. This is too cruel a fate. Every man's hand will be lifted against me. So God put a mark on him so that no man would raise his hand against Cain. If God was the one who said and meant, he who sheds a man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, why would God put a mark on the first murderer so that no man would raise his hand against Cain. Those are some of the mysteries of the Bible, and they don't seem to bother those what are called Bible believing Christians. How could there be other men in the world on the earth who would menace Cain if the only two people who were here that produced children were Adam and Eve? Yet there were others here because Cain went to a place, I don't remember if it was the land of Nod, and he took a wife. Well, maybe he married an orangutan. Maybe he married a chimpanzee. Maybe he married a snail. Snails could have been bigger in those days. You don't know what was going on then, but it's why many things that human beings produce, especially in the way of writing, must be taken with a grain of salt when they inject mysticism, ghosts, goblins, supernatural forces that supposedly can be persuaded to interfere and become involved in the activities of human beings. There is a verse and it says, the fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. There must not be very many righteous men. And what about the righteous women? The Bible, as Mark Twain said, and again, I'm paraphrasing, is an interesting book. It has murder, war, mayhem, and 2,000 or 3,000 lies, actually more than that. But I say to each his own, to each her own. If somebody disagrees strongly with you, nothing you say will make any difference. Why become angry because of a difference of opinion? And that brings me to the subject that I have difficulty staying away from, and that's Cyrus the virus, known otherwise as COVID-19. Now, there are other coronaviruses, of which COVID is one, and that is kind of a way of identifying this particular strain. The COVID stands for corona, CO, virus, VI, disease. Coronavirus disease is shortened to COVID. And by putting the number 19, then that lets you know the year that it was discovered. But there are other coronaviruses, and this one has begun to mutate. The Omicron, the Delta, there may be others. Some people say all of this is a hoax, that there are no such things as diseases. There should not be any vaccines. Well, to each person, his or her poison. And with COVID, the punishment goes with the sin. The sin carries its punishment. And I use the term sin advisedly, but the action carries its own consequences. You don't believe in vaccines, you don't want to get vaccinated. Well, there's a price that will be paid. And when it's paid, when it comes due, you will have to pay the piper. What I did before coming down today is to call Johnny Rogers. Johnny is about 14 years younger than I am, maybe a little few years more than that. But at any rate, he is now 70 years old from what I read in the paper. I'll be 85 in July. So let's say between 14 and 15 years older I am than Johnny. When I was cutting hair at the barber shop on 25th and Spencer, near 24th and Spencer in Dan Goodwin's barber shop, Johnny used to get his hair cut there. And so I knew him from the time he was a small lad. I was aware of what he did in high school playing football. Johnny was a whale of an athlete. He never was that large when you consider the size of the other people who played football. But What he lacked in weight and size, he made up for with elusiveness, speed, and an uncanny ability to not be where they thought he was when they attempted to make a tackle. And because of that, 50 years ago, last year, Johnny made a run in a football game called the Game of the Century between Nebraska and Oklahoma. And naturally, I was pulling for Oklahoma. Johnny received the punt, and Johnny ran through that Oklahoma defense like a hot knife through butter. He ran all the way back for a touchdown. It is a classic play. Some people use the term iconic. It hasn't been seen again in exactly the way Johnny did it. And he was so elusive, was so fast that he was given the nickname of Jet, not just because it starts with a J and his name starts with a J, Johnny the Jet. They called him that because he could move like a jet plane. Well, Johnny didn't think he ought to get vaccinated against COVID because he didn't like to have things injected into his body. Do you think I would fall out with Johnny because he chose not to be vaccinated? Do you think I'd argue with him? I would discuss it with him, but I wouldn't argue because it's up to him to live his life the way he chooses and die the way his life leads up to his dying. I found the articles that I'd been looking for that describes Johnny's run-in with COVID, and I'm going to read them, then have a comment or two, because I talked to Johnny by phone just before coming in today. Headline from a December 6th World Herald article, Husker legend is in hospital with COVID. Subhead, Rogers was admitted to intensive care unit, but is, quote, feeling much better, unquote, business partner says. Husker football legend Johnny Rogers has been hospitalized in intensive care with COVID-19. Denny Drake, who has been Rogers' business partner for 25 years, said Rogers was hospitalized Thanksgiving morning at the Nebraska Medical Center. Rogers also developed pneumonia, Drake said. A few days after being hospitalized, he seemed to be doing better, Drake said. That first weekend, Rogers posted this on Facebook, quote, I am thankful for my children and family and thankful for the many friends that I have. Thank you for the years and years of support and showing me you care. In our lives, we will face many kinds of adversaries. In our flesh, we might feel that there is no hope, that no one cares about us. And I knew what he was leading up to. He's going to get into mysticism. But these are moments to keep praying, to, quote, keep alert and be thankful, unquote. Yes, to thank God, confident that he hears our prayers and that we can trust him, unquote. A few days later, on Tuesday, Rogers, quote, took a turn in the wrong direction, unquote, Drake said, and was admitted to the intensive care unit. Quote, he was pretty weak until late yesterday, Drake said Sunday afternoon. He called me this morning and his voice sounded good. He said he had taken a turn toward recovery and was feeling much better. Drake said additional information should be available this week. After a stellar career at Omaha Tech High, Rogers broke numerous records at Nebraska as part of national title winning teams in 1970 and 71, 2 seasons, and earned the nickname the Jet. He also had one of the most famous plays in Husker and college football history with his punt return for a touchdown in the game of the century against Oklahoma. He capped his career with the Heisman Trophy, a first for a Husker, in 1972, and was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in the year 2000. He is also an entrepreneur, community activist, and author. He and Drake are partners at Performance Solutions Worldwide and are co-founders along with William Reed of the Jet Award Foundation and Trust, which hands out the Jet Award annually to the top return specialists in college football. And that was written by Deputy Sports Editor Kristen Donovan. No, that's who contributed to this. Nancy Gardner wrote the article. Now here's the next one. This is December 15th, 9 days later. Rodgers is back home after battle with COVID. Sub, he was unvaccinated, but urges others to get the shot. Little sips of air. That's all Johnny Rodgers could muster. The 1972 Heisman Trophy winner lay in an Omaha hospital bed in late November, an oxygen mask strapped to his head, thinking about nothing but breathing. Quote, as long as I could take a sip, I could get better, unquote, the 70-year-old Husker football legend said Tuesday. I couldn't quit. Rodgers returned to his Omaha home this past weekend following a harrowing month-long COVID scare that consumed several members of his family. The Jet himself lost 35 or 40 pounds. His muscle and strength are gone. He still needs oxygen, quote, all day, all night, unquote. He suspects he'll need a year to recover. Rodgers regrets that he hadn't been vaccinated against COVID. You all have heard that expression. Experience is the best teacher, and some will have no other. Johnny was one of those who would have no other. But the difference between Johnny and some hard-headed, thick-skulled people, Johnny learned from that experience. He has numerous friends, numerous admirers, family members, and he doesn't want them to make the same mistake he made. He's not speaking theoretically as I do, because I don't remember when I had any kind of sickness. I don't get sick. Even viruses and bacteria don't care much for me. They leave me alone. I'm an outcast among the disease causers. However, I don't take chances. I get a flu shot every year. As I said last week, I'd gotten a pneumonia shot several years ago, and I don't have to get another one. I never had a touch of pneumonia, nothing. I don't get a cough. I don't get headaches. I guess I ought not regret that too much. But at any rate, Johnny learned, and he doesn't want those he care about to go through what he went through. And I'm afraid that there are going to be people who know Johnny, and he's going to have to adopt what Jesus said about some people. They won't believe though one returned from the dead, and COVID will take them home, but they won't come back. But let me continue this article and finish it. I repeat, Rodgers regrets that he hadn't been vaccinated against COVID. Quote, I have to recommend that people do get vaccinated. If they don't, they're not going to be as strong as me. They won't make it. They won't make it. You can shake it, you can bake it, but in the end, you won't make it. And when it comes to your life, Cyrus the virus will take it. continuing. Roger's family members first got crushed by the virus. His daughter, Latanya, and her mother, Shirley Pons. They were sick in Denver when Roger's son, Terry, drove 500 miles to help out. Then Terry got sick also. The University of Colorado Hospital would only admit his daughter. Quote, they had no beds, Johnny said. So he waited for his daughter to turn the corner, then transported Terry and Shirley back to Omaha, where more help was available. Rogers knew he'd likely contract COVID from the 10-hour drive, but he did not think he had any choice. A week later, as his family members improved, Rogers came down with a virus. I was expecting it, but this says he came down with a fever, a precursor to the virus. There was a song, and one of the lines, they were clever. It said, then I heard my Uncle Sam say, here I am. Uncle Sam wants you, boy. Well, that's what Cyrus said. Johnny said, quote, I was expecting it, unquote. Johnny had not gotten vaccinated. He had no experience of a personal kind with anybody who had a run-in with Cyrus. But then members of his family were smitten. When God was having this contest with Satan, they were making little wagers. Satan wanted to show God that he could make Job curse him. And God said, do what you want to him at first, but don't put your hand on him. Then Satan said, skin for skin, all that a man hath will he give for his life. So God said, well, you can torment him, you can afflict him, but don't take his life. Johnny knew that Cyrus the virus was one who will take your life. There'll be no bargaining, no saying I'm sorry, and it make any difference. Fortunately, Johnny was strong enough to still be here. On Thanksgiving morning, the 50th anniversary of Rogers' famous punt return in the game of the century, his doctor directed him to go to the Nebraska Medical Center emergency room. Rogers wanted no part of a ventilator where he feared he'd lose consciousness and determination. He spent a week in an oxygen mask, almost sleepless. He couldn't even take a normal breath. This is Johnny the Jet. His engines had been cut off. His motion had been converted into standstillism, go nowhereism, facing possible deathism. Quote, it took every bit of resolve I had to realize I couldn't do nothing, but I had to do something. I had to fight. As long as I could do something, I could make it. Slowly, Rogers pulled through. Once his breathing progressed, he tried to resume the simplest movements. At first, he could not stand up, couldn't even hold up his arm or lift his leg. Then he could do it once, then twice. 2 weeks after his hospital admission, Rogers returned home with no medication aside from oxygen. Had Johnny not been as strong as he was, it would have been a different outcome. Rogers resisted the vaccines because they were, quote, experimental, unquote, he said, not according to science. Nobody can guarantee what impact a medicine is going to have, even if you're not allergic to it. In that sense, you could say everything is experimental even food, because you could eat food and have the kind of reaction that could take you out of here. But if by experimental, you mean there's no background in science, not enough information or knowledge to make statements about what it is likely to do, even though there's no guarantee, it's not experimental in the ordinary sense of that word. It is science speaking loud and clear. And although some people who've been vaccinated have contracted the virus and died, but these generally are older people. Those who are not older and who have no underlying condition will get a milder version. And instead of dying, they'll produce more antibodies to ward off what they did catch. Am I a doctor? No. Am I a scientist? No. Do I profess to be either one? No. But I can read and I understand what I read. And I can listen to people who have done the writing of the things that I read. And I have confidence in what they've written. And when there are millions of people who've gotten vaccinated who don't come down with the virus, but there are hundreds of thousands who didn't get vaccinated and they're dying, I say the evidence is such that I'd put my money on the vaccine. It's like that song, it was a comedy song, bet on Stu Ball, he's gonna win, win, win. Bet on Stu Ball, because he's gonna win. But Stu Ball, in the process of running, could have broken a leg. But that's an unforeseen event, and such unforeseen events can befall anybody at any time. But Johnny wished that he had gotten the vaccination, and he advises those who have confidence in what he says based on his experience, they should get the vaccination. I'm going to go up at the beginning of this paragraph again. Rogers resisted the vaccines because they were, quote, experimental, unquote, he said. He did not want to put something unknown into his body, aside from the occasional bourbon and Coke. Quote, I'm so healthy, I'm an herbalist. But that was not enough to stave off Cyrus the virus, who is desirous to make us all expire. But Rogers said he's, quote, not doing the right thing if I don't point people toward the vaccine, even though it's experimental. You got to get all the help you can get right now because it's serious, for real. It ain't no joke, unquote. On Saturday, Rogers missed the Heisman Trophy ceremony in New York, his first absence since he won the award 49 years ago. That's what Cyrus the virus can do. That day, Rogers received a phone call he'd been waiting for. His mother had died. Ardella Rogers had been confined to a bed for months with Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. Johnny summoned the energy to spend a day with her last week. Upon her passing, he actually felt relieved. Quote, she was suffering more than me, unquote. Ardella and Johnny basically grew up together, Rogers said, just 14 years apart. Both accomplished a lot, escaping poverty and earning college degrees. Quote, we came a long way, but we had to come from something. She started us off. Life transpires too quickly, Rogers said, but the past month feels like much, much longer. His focus now is starting over. Johnny the Jet, like that first plane at Kitty Hawk, where several people gathered to talk. Kitty Hawk, South Carolina, where the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, made the first flight. Oh, here's a little rhyme. The first plane to make a flight was made by Orville and Wilbur Wright. On the sand dunes at Kitty Hawk, several people came to watch and talk. And now I'll leave that alone and come back here and walk my way through this article, which has here and there a particle. Anyway, Johnny's focus now is starting over, getting back to normal. Quote, I don't want to be a superhero, but if I can get back to where I was, I'll be so happy I won't know what to do. Just give me back what I had and unnecessarily lost. I threw that in. Rogers has a favorite saying, quote, every day is game day, unquote. And this is no time to get complacent. Every day, friend Mike Yanni, and Yanni he sees me as an enemy. He's made a lot of money. He's an investor. He's a developer. He's the one who persuaded the Douglas County people to build that kid jail in downtown where no jail should be. No jail of any kind should be downtown. It's small. The rooms don't have enough space. There are things about it that were not acceptable to the jail standards people, but they're not in a position to say you can't build it. So already there's conversation going on about making improvements and it hasn't even been built. Not enough natural light, no place for recreation, and there will be an over-representation of Black people and Latino people, as always happens, because when white people hold the keys to the jail, they have more of us in there than their own kind. But anyway, everyday friend Mike Yanni calls and checks on him. Every day his son and daughter stop by. Rogers' sister, who lives across the street, comes over and mocks his arms that, quote, look like fingers. Hey, little man, she says, driving him crazy. Now I'm going to use the language Johnny used in this article. I don't use that language. I don't need it. It's beneath me. But I'm reading his words and I'm not going to prettify his words. I'm not going to translate and interpret his words. I will read his words and then I might comment. But I'm not going to read something that he didn't say because I don't use that kind of language. Continuing, but little moments of joy and laughter are emerging. A few days ago, a friend stopped by with fresh cookies. Them cookies were so goddamn good, I tell you. Guess which word I don't use? It's not cookies. It's that other one. Johnny's appetite is back. So is his sense of humor. Can you believe he spent the 50th anniversary in the ICU? Give me, game of the century, man. It was a hell of a fight again. Now here comes the word that I don't use like he used it. I had to kick COVID's ass. I had to kick pneumonia's ass, and they were fighting like a dog. We had it out. And I came from behind and pulled it out at the end, just like in the movie, unquote. Optimism propelled the jet as a kid from the river bottoms of North Omaha to the grandest stage in college football. And optimism kept him breathing all alone in the hospital. I was winning a sip at a time. That's what I told myself, and that's what happened. But the main thing Johnny wants people to know is that they should get vaccinated. And because I've discussed him from time to time, I wanted to come back with a report from him. I talked to him just before I came down here, and guess what Johnny had done? He had played a game of racquetball, excuse me. I was thinking of Rocket Man because of what he's doing. He's up and about, but he's not going to overdo it. He said he lost the muscles in his arms, all of them in his back, his rear end, his legs, all of it gone, but he's going to work his way back. And I told him that because of the conditioning that he had done in his early life, the shape he was in, he will make it back. And because his sense of humor is back, my nonsense came back. I said, Johnny, here's what I'm thinking about. Now, you've been described as an entrepreneur, 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 something like that. That's a foreign word to me. And it is a foreign word. I don't speak anything but English. And some people would say that poorly, which is all right. If I'm understood, that's what counts. The purpose of all communication is to be understood, whether you use drums, smoke signals, writing, speech, music. If you can transmit what's in your mind to the person you're giving it to, that comprises communication. And that's what all these signals that we send out from us to somebody else is about. Communicating to them what is in us that we want them to understand. I told him that I want him to hire me as his agent, and I am going to get him a contract in the NFL to play football. The first player at Nebraska to get a Heisman Trophy, the first one to get COVID and recover at 70 years old, and I want to get him a contract in the NFL. And I want to get him a contract to play, not running back, because he is a little small for that. We won't call it split end, but we'll call it Johnny the Jet hanger and launching pad. That's what will be. And Johnny laughed. But wouldn't it be something? What I did when Gale Sayers was at his peak with the Chicago Bears, I wrote a letter to George Halas, the coach, and told him that he was known for doing things that were outside the box, that Gale has a brother who is faster than Gale. He may not have the moves, but he could be considered for returning punts. And Roger used to get his hair cut at the barber shop. And I mentioned that this is what I want to do. And Bill Armstrong was a barber there at the time. Dan Goodwin, the proprietor, was there. And he thought we were kidding. And maybe everybody else did, but I wasn't kidding. And after we talked about it, we decided that that's a good thing to do. When I say we, I mean the barbers. So I wrote the letter. All three of us signed it and sent it. And guess what happened? Roger got a phone call and he was given a tryout. So it was not all in vain. You don't know what you can do until you try and unless you try. You will never see me discouraging people from doing anything that will improve self, strengthen your belief in yourself, get that iron in your spine that will let you stand without falling simply because somebody disagrees with you. Persuade you to trust your judgment and have confidence in yourself. That's what I would be about. And if it goes amiss and you're not interested, that's your prerogative. I still wouldn't feel it was time wasted. We don't know how much attention somebody is paying to what we're saying. They may not even know. But at any rate, the letter was written, Roger got his tryout. As Black people, we cannot be downhearted or disheartened because of the horrible things that were done to our ancestors all those years ago, decades ago, scores of decades ago. Inhuman and certainly inhumane mistreatment, the ravishing or raping of our women, of our little girls, and quiet as it's kept, but not quiet enough for these white people of today. Thomas Jefferson, the one who is given credit for being the main writer of the Declaration of Independence, which says, we, white people, hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and it is my, except black men, are created equal. But he didn't put that in because he was trying to show Britain, England, George III, who was the king, that the colonists in America who had come from England are equal to the Englishman who's never set foot off the island. So he was talking about the equality between American white colonists and Britishers. He couldn't have been talking about black people because he had enslaved black people and was making babies on his female slaves. What do you think he thought about when he's wrapped up in her arms and having sex and will sell the baby who will be born? Oh, you all didn't know that Thomas Jefferson bred slaves for the purpose of selling the children that he produced? And he was a religious, righteous man. Although he was what they call an agnostic, he didn't know whether there was a God or not. And based on his conduct, he certainly didn't believe that there was any moral obligation he had to treat people with respect, dignity. He bred slave children. And slave is a word that has been rejected by a lot of people because it designates property. So they use the term enslaved persons. You don't lose your humanity, your personhood, because somebody through sheer brute force can put you in a state of servitude from which you cannot escape. And there were some slave men and numerous women who chose death over being enslaved. But old Tom and the rest of them, George Washington also had hundreds of slaves, knew how they could make you wish for death, but they wouldn't let death come. They would have somebody beat you until you were bloody. You had no strength. Then they would take brine, put a lot of salt and water, not to heal your wounds, but to give you increased agony, excruciating agony. And they would have the other slaves watch all of this. Listen to the shrieks, the screams, the pleading for death. And Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, Francis Scott Key, all of the white heroes talking a good game, engaging in these inhumane practices. They're known as the founding fathers. If you added to that, fathers of the greatest cruelty ever visited on one people by another, then they are the founding fathers, because they created a type of slavery that was unknown anywhere in the history of this world before or since. Slavery was not a word in other languages because nobody could own another. Somebody could capture another and put that person in a status of solitude, but that person remained a person. And there were certain things that could not be done to those persons in solitude without violating the law. But when it came to us, it was entirely different. And this is why some of these so-called anti-CRT critical race theory people don't want those things taught. They said it will have little white children apologizing for being white. These things are not even taught in grade school. But where were the white Christians of concern when I, as a very small lad, the only one of my complexion in grade school, with a teacher, although not personally known to my parents, a teacher, my parents, before I left home and was sent to the clutches of this teacher, taught me to respect my teacher. They were all females at that time because she would teach me things that I needed to know and that I would learn nowhere else. But my parents did not warn me that this teacher would create a set of circumstances for me to be humiliated, shamed, embarrassed, not understanding why this was being done to me. And that was when she read the story of Little Black Sambo and had caricatures drawn, the black blob, big red lips, eyes like saucers with dots on them, little braids with 1,000 ribbons, and the little white kids could laugh. My parents didn't prepare me for that. They probably had no inkling that when I went to this white school, that their child would be treated in that fashion. And there was nobody I could turn to. And I hadn't done anything to those white people. I had shown respect. I always was a respectful, obedient child. I didn't get in trouble. That doesn't mean I never did anything wrong. You know how I entered a life of crime? We would go into this garden and steal tomatoes, never more than we could eat. I found out later that the people who owned the garden knew it, and they would have given us the tomatoes. But at any rate, there I was in that classroom, these things being done to me. And these racist white people today say that they don't want their little children taught about what white people had done because it will make them embarrassed and ashamed of being white. Well, they're not ashamed because we say what your ancestors did. You're ashamed because of what they did. And these people who don't want critical race theory taught don't want the truth taught. They want to expunge the truth of history from history when so-called history is taught to white children. And if any of them who've been deprived of this factual information wind up with a scholarship to some other country, and these people in that country know more about this white kid's history than the white kid, and the white kid would deny that this even happened, he'd be a laughing stock. He'd be run right back to the shores of this most racist of racist countries. I repeat these things. They bear repeating. Just like when that teacher repeated the insult that was the name of that child in that story, Little Black Sambo. But I didn't identify with what she showed me in that book. I identified with the ridicule that was being heaped on that child, and the white kids looked at me. And the teacher never said, "We don't laugh at each other," when they laughed at me, although she was very adamant about little white kids not laughing at each other if they did something that genuinely was funny. The teacher said, "We don't laugh at each other." And she could have added, "We'll save that for Ernest over there." White people, not all of them, can be vicious and cruel. And when you add to that cruelty Christianity, you've got a combination that would make the so-called monster Frankenstein shudder, make the Wolfman howl and take off running, make Dracula say, "Their blood is unfit for a vampire to drink because it may reduce me to the level of cruelty that they occupy." Did I make Thomas Jefferson a slaveholder? Did I make George Washington a slaveholder? Did I make Francis Scott Key, who wrote the words to the national anthem, a slaveholder? Did I compel Patrick Henry, known for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death"? Did I make him a slaveholder? Then why am I to be condemned when I describe what these vicious, low-down, inhumane, racist dogs? Let me apologize to the dogs. Dogs don't do other dogs the way these white people did Black people, and then produce babies and sell them. There were Black women who killed their children when they were born rather than have them grow up and live a life of slavery. Frederick Douglass described a situation where this spoiled white woman had a baby and made the Black woman take care of the child. And the Black woman nodded off, and the white woman was asleep, and the baby started crying. And the white woman woke up, and she was furious because her white baby in the arms of this Black woman had done what babies do, and that was to cry. And the Black woman had done what weary people do, was to fall asleep. But for that, it was considered a capital offense. And that woman went and got one of those big pieces of wood that were used for the fireplace and shattered this woman's skull, killed her, and was not charged with a crime. And yet this Black woman was taking care of this white wench's offspring. And the little white baby would be reared to be just like its daddy. But see, I wouldn't refer to a child as an it. That baby was not responsible for being in this world. That baby did not choose his or her parents. But those people demonstrate why a man who's one of my favorite poets, he was an Irishman, said, parents are the very ones who should not have children. Unfit. It's hard for me not to discuss these subjects because this attitude that I'm describing informs the policies and practices in this country and its government. While boasting to the rest of the world about being a democracy, their legislatures are in the process of drafting legislation to deprive us of the right to vote, making it so difficult. There are some states where the lines are long, and if it's a hot day and you have a friend in that line and you give that friend a drink of water, then you commit a crime. You cannot give those people any nourishment or water. That's what these racist white people have put into the law, and they're the master race, yet masters of hatred, cruelty, and unspeakable wickedness. Elijah Muhammad had it correct as far as it went when he called them blue-eyed devils, but he owed the devil an apology. He owed the devil an apology. And these people professed to be Christians. For the last few days, I've been immersed, IMMERSED, immersed in studying about these so-called Indian boarding schools. They were supposed to be industrial training schools. And these little children were separated from the tribe of which they were a member, their parents, by compulsion. They were literally kidnapped, taken to these places. Their hair was cut off. And to Native Americans, hair, it's not magical in the sense of abracadabra, but there's a spiritual significance rooted in their traditions and culture associated with their hair. There was a little town in Nebraska where a school secretary cut the hair off these young Native American girls. And the parents objected, but that didn't stop it. Finally, they took the matter to court, where I'm sure they're going to win. But at any rate, that is the arrogance. These children were beaten bloody. I read about a testimony that a woman gave decades ago when Congress had gotten word about the cruelties being inflicted on these Native children. And she said that this little girl had done something. And these kids were farmed out to these white farmers and white people in these little towns where they were sexually abused, assaulted. They were supposed to be paid for the work. They never got paid. If they disobeyed one of these white people, then there was hell to pay when they got back to this cruel place. This one little girl came back and she was bloody. Her face was swollen, discolored, blood in her clothes. And this woman was an employee at the school. She was a matron. She asked, what happened? And the little girl told her that the superintendent had beaten her. This is testimony the woman gave before Congress. And when the congresspersons were stunned by it and asked, well, why didn't you say anything? She had been told that any complaints that were filed would be sent back to the school, so-called, and they had had it made known to them that they would be fired and never able to get a job again. So they watched this cruelty and were made unwilling co-conspirators. That's what happened to the native children. And the slogan was that there's something wrong with being an Indian. That's the word that they used, although they had never been to India. Kill the Indian in the child and save the man. In other words, exterminate what is Indian in them, teach them to be like white people, live like white people, walk and talk like white people, but still be rejected. So the children were uprooted by force. The parents had no say so. If parents hid their children, then they would be punished because a very careful census was maintained. When a birth occurred, it was noted. And if there were not the requisite number of children based on the number born during a certain period of time, then there was hell to pay on the part of the parents until they gave up their children. In Canada, it was horrendous and led to investigations, not only in Canada, but on this side of the line in the United States. They found literally hundreds of unmarked graves of children. They used ground penetrating radar that would detect the bone. Radar, these are radio microwaves, and if they strike something that's hard, then it reflects the wave back and a machine picks it up. But at any rate, they began to find these hundreds of children's bodies. So they started checking things out on this side of the border, and the same thing obtained. There was one of these schools, it was the fourth one built in this country. There may have been 25 of the government held factories and churches, mainly the Catholic Church, but the Methodists, the Quakers, others ran these places, and the children were all victimized. And if you think that they would not be sexually abused back then when it was approved, look at what happens today with the sexual abuse of these children by Catholic priests who were covered for, even by the Pope. The last Pope who retired so that the current Pope could take over had been the Archbishop in Germany. His name was Ratzinger, and I called him Ratzinger the Rat. And the other day he made an apology about things he had allowed to happen in Germany in terms of sexual abuse of children by priests. That's what happened with these churches. And right now, while I'm speaking, there are what are called reconciliation groups that the church representatives are going to apologize. Some of the churches are opening their archives and their records, not because they want to do the right thing, but because of the possibility that some of these descendants of those children, many of whom were murdered at these facilities, these descendants may be able to find somebody who was a member of their tribe, who may have been a member of their family, but at any rate, the remains could be recovered and buried either on the reservation or in a family cemetery plot. Now, I'm hated by a lot of white people. When I was in the legislature, not only was I the most known person in Nebraska, but the most hated man in Nebraska. That's why they amended their constitution to get term limits to get rid of one black man. But when I became aware of the fact that the university, the historical society, and museums had on display the remains of native people, I got a bill and I had to fight to get it to make sure that all of the remains of native people, whether they were in boxes, stored in closets, in display cases, had to be returned to the families if they could be determined. If that couldn't be determined, then to the tribe from which they originated. And if that couldn't be determined, to a tribe willing to take them and give them a respectful, decent burial. It was the first law of its kind in this country and became a model for federal legislation. Just as my resolution that said that no state funds should be invested in companies that did business in or with South Africa. Any funds that this state had for investment could not be invested in those operations. Well, naturally, the investment officer talked about how much interest they got and they could lose that. And I said, well, if you're talking about a return on your money, should the state go into the dope selling business? Because you can make a huge amount of money there. But Nebraska did not pass my resolution because they wanted to do the right thing. None of the arguments that I gave against the vicious kind of segregation known as apartheid in South Africa made any difference. None of that. So why did they do it? A white racist played into my hands. He gave the university $3,000 in Krugerrands. These are the gold coins that were wanted throughout the world because they had the highest content of gold. And the amount of gold weighed over 100 pounds. They had to send 3 vehicles to cart them all to the university. That racist played into my hands. There are people out there who hate me, but they've come to know that I was the master of the rules, parliamentary procedure, and controlling the legislative process. I could stop it when I wanted to. One black man outnumbered by 48 white people, and I could stop the legislature when I wanted to. One woman put in the paper, the governor may control the purse strings, but Ernie sets the agenda for the legislature. So being always alert to see an opening that would put me in a position to use my knowledge under their rules to obtain what they wouldn't do because it was just. I said, here's what I'm going to do, because my resolution had been introduced. I'd introduced it, there'd been a hearing. The consul general of South Africa, who was headquartered in Chicago, they didn't have real ambassadors because they didn't have that kind of relationship. America in its hypocritical racist self didn't want that kind of connection to South Africa, but they let the consul general have an office there. He came and testified against the bill. asked how could I know what goes on in South Africa without being there? And I said, well, you're wearing shoes. I don't know that your shoes have a sole and a heel, but I believe they do. I know they do. And I'll bet you $1,000 against a penny that they do. And I've never seen the underside of your shoes. Well, I knew how to get those people. Here's what I told my colleagues. When the budget comes up for the university, I'm going to have somebody calculate the dollar value of those Krugerrands, and that is the money I'm going to deduct from the university's budget. And they knew I didn't shoot blanks. So the senators from Lincoln, where the university is located, asked me, Ernie, what can we do to persuade you not to do that? I said, I've got a resolution. You all know what it is, to stop investing state funds in South Africa or any company doing business in or with South Africa. Pass my resolution and I will release the funds that go to the university located in Lincoln. And you know, those devils did? Not all of them voted for my resolution, but they voted to pass it in sufficient numbers. And I believe my time is up. So how many minutes? Okay. I was given the word that I got a few more minutes. I'll finish that story. I told them that if you vote for my resolution, it had those whereases, talked about the racism, the cruelty, the mistreatment of the Black people in South Africa, and all of that history. Vote for that resolution, and I'll let you have your budget. Now, how arrogant could somebody be? How self-centered, how presumptuous could a lone Black man be to dare to tell 48 white people who have the votes, if you don't give me what I want, I will take money out of the budget that would go to the university. Couldn't they get 48 votes? There were 48 of them, but here's what they knew. Like tentacles or like roots that go deep into the earth and proliferate and spread, they knew there was other legislation pending. And they knew that not every senator would vote for their legislation. And if Senator A had a bill and he had offended me, then Mr. A couldn't count on Mr. B because Mr. B didn't want me to go after his legislation as I was going to do after Mr. A. So you could say it was like a reign of terror, but it was righteous terror. And it was not terror, it was mastery of the rules and the legislative process, learning their rules, mastering them and the procedures of the legislature, and beating them at their own game. A grown Black man who knew how to fight, not an innocent Black child who didn't know how to fight and couldn't fight. And I think of all the other little Black children to whom that happened. So in a sense, I'm avenging them by the way I do in the legislature. But unlike white people, my arms, my protective arms, embraced all of those who had no voice, no friends, were among those I described as the least, the last, and the lost. I didn't care about their religion. I didn't care about their color, complexion, national origin, or their sexual orientation. They were human beings, and my job as a member of the legislature was to make sure that the laws were just and fair, meaning that no person was above that law, no person was below that law. And I did the kind of job that made them conclude that 30 years after I croak, I'll probably be in their Hall of Fame, which doesn't mean anything to me. But before I left the legislature, I became the only living person who had anything in that Capitol building named after him or her. There are other people who have things named after them, but nobody who is alive and still functioning, as was the case with me. And I say now, what the canary said when they let him know the cage door was open, I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.